The dust motes danced in the slivers of weak afternoon light that dared to trespass upon the gloom of her father's study. They were, Lady Alara Vance thought with a detached sort of bitterness, the only things that moved with any freedom in this house any more. Everything else was weighted down, caught in the thick, cloying amber of impending ruin. The scent of stale brandy and desperation clung to the velvet curtains, a permanent miasma that soap and open windows could not erase. Her father, Baron Vance, sat behind his great mahogany desk, a place where he had once commanded respect and managed a fortune. Now he seemed a creature shrunken by his own folly, his shoulders slumped, the skin of his face loose and papery. Before him lay the ledger, its pages a testament to a slow, agonizing bleed, a chronicle of bad bets, worse investments, and a pride that refused to acknowledge the cliff's edge until their heels were already hanging over it. "There is nothing left, Ilara," he said, his voice a dry rasp, the words brittle as autumn leaves. He did not look at her, but at the damning figures in black and red. "The London house is forfeit, the lands mortgaged to the hilt. This house, our very home, will be next. Another month, perhaps 2. Ilara stood by the window, her hands clasped so tightly before her that her knuckles were white peaks in a landscape of pale skin. She had known this was coming. She had felt it in the thinning of the stew, in the quiet dismissal of the footman, in the way her mother's smiles had become fragile, glassy things, prone to shattering. She had known, but hearing the finality of it was like a physical blow, a cold stone settling deep in her stomach. She was 20 years old, possessed of a good mind, a respectable lineage, and a quiet dignity that was now her only remaining currency, and it was about to be spent. "There must be something," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. "A distant cousin, an appeal to—" "To whom?" Her father finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot and weary. "We have appealed to everyone. We have exhausted every avenue of goodwill. Our name is Mud, girl. We are a cautionary tale whispered over port in gentlemen's clubs." He sighed, a sound of utter defeat. "There is one offer, not of a loan, a proposition." Ilara's blood ran cold. She knew what this meant. In their world, a proposition for a penniless but titled young woman meant only one thing: marriage, a transaction where she was the goods. "It is from the Marquis of Blackwood," her father said, the name dropping into the silent room like a block of granite. "The Marquis of Blackwood, Alistair Beaumont," a name spoken in hushed, speculative tones throughout the ton. He was impossibly wealthy, powerful, the master of vast, sprawling estates in the north, but he was also a recluse, a man shrouded in tragedy. His young wife had died some years ago in a horrific fire, leaving him with a single small child. Since then he had not been seen in society. He was a ghost in his own life, a figure of grim romance and dark rumor. They said he was cold, unfeeling, a man whose heart had been turned to ash with his wife. "He requires a wife," her father continued, his gaze falling back to the desk, "a mother for his child, a woman of good breeding to act as marchioness and manage his household." "And in return," Ilara asked, her voice barely a whisper, "he will settle all our debts, every last one. He will provide a generous allowance for your mother and me, enough to live out our days in comfort. Your future and ours would be secure." Secure, it sounded like a prison sentence. To be shackled to a man who did not want a wife, but a functionary. A man who, by all accounts, was incapable of love or even warmth. She imagined a life in a cold northern castle, walking silent halls, her only companion a man made of marble and memory. "Why me?" she pressed, a flicker of bewildered pride asserting itself. "He could have anyone. Why the daughter of a ruined baron?" "Because," her father said with a brutal honesty that was perhaps the only kindness he could offer, "you are a bargain, Ilara. You have the title, the breeding he requires for his heir, but none of the troublesome connections or expectations that would come with a bride from a more prominent family. You are unencumbered, and we are desperate. He knows this. He is a man who appreciates a straightforward transaction. A straightforward transaction. Her life, her heart, her future, all bundled and sold to the highest bidder." Tears pricked at her eyes, hot and sharp, but she refused to let them fall. She was a Vance. Their honor might be in tatters, but her dignity was her own. She lifted her chin, her gaze fixed on a portrait of her great-grandmother, a woman known for her fortitude. "And what are his terms?" she asked, the question sounding strangely formal in the quiet study. Her father slid a heavy sheet of parchment across the polished wood of the desk. It was a letter, penned in a severe black script, the letters sharp and decisive. It was not a proposal, it was a contract. Ilara did not need to read it. She knew what it would say. It would speak of duties, of responsibilities, of household management and the provision of an heir. It would contain clauses and stipulations. It would not contain a single word of affection, of hope, of companionship. It would be the blueprint for a hollow life. She thought of her mother, her gentle hands and her fraying nerves. She thought of her father, a broken man who had gambled away everything. She thought of the shame, the eviction, the descent into genteel poverty that awaited them. And then she thought of herself, standing on the precipice. She could refuse. She could choose destitution and a sliver of freedom. A freedom to starve, perhaps. Or she could step into the gilded cage and save them all. Was it a choice at all? "I will meet with him," she said, her voice clear and resolved. The dust motes continued their careless, sunlit dance, oblivious to the fact that a life had just been irrevocably signed away. The meeting took place not at their crumbling home, but in a sterile solicitor's office in London, a neutral ground that underscored the transactional nature of the entire affair. The room was panelled in dark wood and smelled of old paper and sealing wax. Ilara wore her best dress, a simple grey silk that had been mended twice, her hands covered by pristine white gloves. She felt like an actress on a stage, playing the part of a lady of quality, while inwardly her heart beat a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs. When the Marquis of Blackwood entered, the room seemed to shrink. He was taller than she had imagined, broad-shouldered and dressed in immaculate black, the severity of his attire relieved only by a stark white cravat. His hair was the color of jet, and his face was the reason for the rumors. It was a masterpiece of cold aristocratic beauty, all sharp angles and unforgiving planes. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were a startling, pale gray, the color of a winter sky, and they held no warmth, no flicker of interest, only a remote, assessing intelligence. He looked at her not as a prospective bride, but as one might inspect a horse he was considering for purchase. "Lady Ilara," he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that was as devoid of emotion as his expression. He gave a curt, formal bow. "Lord Blackwood," she replied, sinking into a respectful curtsy, her own voice a faint echo in the oppressive silence. He did not waste time on pleasantries. He gestured to the chair opposite the one he took at the head of the long, polished table, the solicitor melting into the background like a nervous shadow. "I trust your father has explained the situation," he began, his grey eyes fixed on her face, searching, she felt, for any sign of weakness or histrionics. "I wish to be perfectly clear about the terms of our arrangement. I am in need of a marchioness. My daughter, Lily, requires a maternal presence. My estate, Blackwood Manor, requires a mistress to oversee its domestic affairs. You, by all accounts, are intelligent, well-educated, and of unimpeachable character. You are suitable." Suitable, the word was like a slap. Not charming, not lovely, not even pleasant. Suitable, a cog to fit into the machine of his life. "In return for these duties," he continued, his voice unchanging, "I will, as stipulated, erase your family's debts and provide them with a comfortable living. You will have a generous personal allowance and the full respect and authority due your station as my wife. You will want for nothing material." He paused, and the weight of the unspoken hung in the air. Ilara braced herself. "However, I must be explicit. This will be a marriage in name and duty only. I do not offer affection, for I have none left to give. My heart is occupied by a memory, and that is a space you will not be asked to enter. We will maintain separate chambers. Our interactions will be civil, formal, and centered on the running of the household and the welfare of my daughter. Once you have provided me with a male heir, all marital obligations between us will cease. Do you understand these terms?" Each word was a carefully placed brick, building a wall between them before they had even exchanged vows. He was not just offering a loveless marriage, he was demanding it. He was warning her away from his soul, posting a clear and unambiguous sign: trespassers will be shunned. A part of her, the young foolish part that had once dreamt of love and romance, wanted to scream, to run from this cold, beautiful, broken man and his chilling proposition. But then she saw her mother's anxious face, her father's defeated slump. She saw the bailiffs at the door of her home. The choice had been made long before she entered this room. She met his gaze directly, her own chin held high. She would not be a weeping, sentimental fool. He wanted a transaction. She would be the very soul of professional decorum. "I understand them perfectly, my lord," she said, her voice betraying none of the turmoil within. "Your terms are explicit, and they are acceptable." For the first time, a flicker of something unreadable passed through his winter-grey eyes. Surprise? Or perhaps a sliver of respect for her composure. He gave a single sharp nod. "Very well. The solicitors will draw up the final contracts. The wedding will be in 1 week, a private ceremony. I see no need for public spectacle." He stood, the interview clearly at an end. My carriage will be sent for you and your maid on the following day to take you to Blackwood Manor. I will expect you to be ready. He turned and walked out of the room without another word, leaving Alara alone with the scent of old paper and the echo of his cold, precise voice. She sat perfectly still for a long moment, her hands clasped in her lap. The contract was sealed. She was to be the Marchioness of Blackwood. She had saved her family. She had also, she was quite certain, just signed the death warrant for her own heart. The journey north was a passage from one world to another. The rolling, gentle hills of the south gradually gave way to a more dramatic and brooding landscape. The skies seemed larger, the clouds heavier, and the wind that swept across the moors carried the scent of damp earth and distant sea. Ilara sat in the Marquis's perfectly sprung carriage, a black lacquered box that moved with a quiet, inexorable purpose, feeling as though she were being transported not to her new home, but to her place of exile. Beside her, Agnes, her loyal maid since childhood, fidgeted with the lace on her cuffs, her round, kindly face a mask of worry. Agnes had been appalled by the arrangement, her silent disapproval a constant comforting presence in the frantic week of preparations. "It's a grand place, I'm sure, my lady," Agnes murmured, peering out the window at the endless expanse of windswept heath. "A proper castle, they say." "It is my home now, Agnes," Ilara replied, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. She tried to inject a note of confidence into her voice, but it came out thin and brittle. Home. The word conjured images of warmth, of laughter, of belonging. She suspected Blackwood Manor would offer none of those things. As they passed through a set of immense wrought-iron gates bearing a crest of a snarling wolf's head, the manor itself came into view. It was not a castle, but a vast, sprawling Elizabethan house of dark grey stone, its many mullioned windows like vacant eyes staring out over the wild, untamed parkland. It was magnificent, imposing, and utterly without welcome. A faint mist clung to its foundations, making it seem as if it were rising from the earth itself, a natural feature of the somber landscape. The carriage crunched to a halt on a gravel drive before a massive oak door. A stern-faced butler, as grey and unyielding as the house itself, opened it before they had even fully stopped. He introduced himself as Mr. Finch, the head of a household staff that seemed to materialize from the shadows, all silent and watchful. Ilara stepped out of the carriage, her grey travelling cloak drawn tightly around her. The air was colder here, sharper. She looked up at the facade of her new prison and felt a profound sense of isolation wash over her. This was it, the beginning of her new life. The Marquis was not there to greet her. Finch informed her, in a monotone that permitted no questions, that his lordship was occupied with estate business and would see her at dinner. She was to be shown to her rooms. The interior of the manor was as imposing as the exterior, a great hall with a soaring hammer-beam roof, walls lined with stern-faced portraits and shadowed suits of armor, and a silence so profound it seemed to have a physical weight. Every footstep echoed. The air was still and cool, carrying the faint, clean scent of beeswax and something else, something like old grief. Her apartments were in the east wing, a suite of rooms that was spacious, opulent, and utterly impersonal. The furniture was heavy and dark. The tapestries depicted grim hunting scenes, and the fire laid in the grate was unlit. It was a guest room, not a bride's chamber. It was a clear, unspoken reinforcement of the Marquis's terms. "You are here, but you do not belong." As Agnes began to unpack, her movements brisk and purposeful in an attempt to create some semblance of normalcy, another figure appeared in the doorway. She was a woman of about 30, fashionably dressed in a deep sapphire gown, her dark hair coiled in an elaborate style. She was handsome, with sharp, intelligent features, but her smile did not reach her eyes. "So, you are the new Marchioness?" the woman said, her voice smooth and cultured, yet with an undercurrent Ilara could not quite decipher. "I am Lady Beatrice Beaumont, Alistair's cousin. I have been running Blackwood for him since the tragedy. I am so very pleased he has finally found someone to take on the burden." The word burden was carefully chosen, a subtle barb disguised as a compliment. Ilara felt an immediate, instinctive prickle of dislike. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Lady Beatrice," Ilara said, her tone polite but reserved. "I am sure I will have much to learn from you." "Oh, I am certain of it," Beatrice replied, her eyes sweeping over Ilara's simple travelling dress with a flicker of disdain. "The house is a complex machine, and then there is the child, of course." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Poor little Lily, she is a delicate case. The fire, you know, it left its mark. She does not speak, not a word since that night. The doctors say the shock was too great. She is a sweet thing, but rather simple. You will need a great deal of patience. She lives in her own little world." The description was delivered with a strange mixture of feigned pity and something else, something colder. Beatrice was painting a picture of a damaged, unreachable child, setting an expectation of failure before Ilara had even met her. Later that afternoon, determined to see her new charge, Ilara made her way to the nursery. It was a large, airy room filled with expensive toys that all looked untouched, and there, sitting on a window seat, was the smallest, most fragile-looking child Ilara had ever seen. Lily Beaumont was perhaps 5 years old, with her father's jet-black hair and a face of heartbreaking porcelain delicacy. She wore a simple white dress and stared out the window, her back to the room. She did not turn when Ilara entered. She did not seem to register her presence at all. Ilara approached slowly, her heart aching for this tiny, silent creature. "Hello, Lily," she said softly. "I am Ilara, your new—" She hesitated. What was she? Stepmother seemed too intimate, too presumptuous. "I have come to live here with you." The child did not move. Her silence was absolute, a void that seemed to suck the very sound from the room. It was not the shy silence of an ordinary child, but something deeper, a deliberate and impenetrable wall. Ilara remembered Beatrice's words, simple, lives in her own little world. But looking at the rigid set of the girl's tiny shoulders, the focused intensity of her gaze out the window, Ilara did not see a simple child. She saw a child who was hiding. Dinner that evening was an ordeal of excruciating formality. It was held in a dining hall that could have seated 50, but there were only 3 of them, Ilara, Alistair, and Beatrice, seated at opposite ends and the side of a vast polished table, the distance between them a yawning chasm. Alistair was as remote and unapproachable as he had been in the solicitor's office. He spoke only when necessary, addressing Beatrice about an estate matter, and Ilara with a curt, "Is your room satisfactory?" "Yes, my lord, thank you," she replied. "Good." And that was the extent of their conversation. He ate with a focused, mechanical precision, his grey eyes never once meeting hers. He was a marble statue, animated by some cold internal mechanism. Beatrice, however, kept up a steady stream of conversation, a monologue on local society, household issues, and thinly veiled questions about Ilara's family and background, each one a subtle probe for weakness. Ilara answered with quiet, non-committal grace, revealing nothing, refusing to be drawn into the woman's games. She felt 2 pairs of eyes on her, Beatrice's, sharp and calculating, and Alistair's, which she could feel even when he was not looking, a heavy, assessing weight. She was being tested, she knew, her endurance, her composure, her ability to withstand the chilling atmosphere of this house. As she lay in her cold, unfamiliar bed that night, the wind howling a mournful song around the eaves of the manor, Ilara felt a profound and terrifying loneliness. She had made her bargain. She had stepped into the cage. Now she had to find a way to survive within it. She thought of the silent, watchful child in the window, and the cold, distant man who was now her husband. 2 locked boxes, she thought, in a house full of secrets, and she was trapped inside with them. The days at Blackwood Manor settled into a rigid, chilling routine. Morning was for household consultations with Finch and the housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, a woman whose loyalty was clearly to the Marquis and the memory of his first wife. Ilara's instructions were received with polite deference but no warmth. She was the new mistress, a role she inhabited like an ill-fitting gown, and the staff watched her every move with a quiet collective judgment. Afternoons were long, silent stretches of time. Ilara would attempt to visit Lily in the nursery, but the child remained a ghost in her own life. She would sit by the window, sometimes with a doll held limply in her lap, but she never played. She simply watched the world outside, her small face pale and still. Ilara would talk to her softly, reading stories aloud, describing the pictures, but her words fell into the silence and vanished. Lily never turned, never acknowledged her. The governess, a timid young woman named Miss Prescott, would hover nervously, offering platitudes. "She is in one of her moods today, my lady." But Lily's mood never seemed to change. Beatrice was a constant cloying presence, offering unsolicited advice with a saccharine smile. She would point out Ilara's supposed mistakes. The flower arrangements were too somber, the menu choices too plain, always framing her criticism as helpful guidance for the naive newcomer. The First Lady Blackwood had such a flair for these things, she would sigh, a poisoned dart wrapped in nostalgia. But one cannot expect everyone to have her gifts. And Alistair was a phantom. He was an absence at the breakfast table, a silent presence at dinner, a shadow passing in a corridor. He spent his days locked in his study or riding out across the vast, wind-swept moors of his estate. He looked through Ilara as if she were made of glass. Their conversations were clipped, functional exchanges about estate matters. He never asked about her day, never showed a flicker of personal interest. He was adhering to the letter of their contract with a chilling, unwavering precision. Ilara felt herself beginning to suffocate in the oppressive atmosphere. The silence, the grief, the constant subtle hostility from Beatrice, it was a poison seeping into her spirit. She needed air. She needed a purpose beyond the sterile management of this mausoleum. One dreary afternoon, seeking escape, she wrapped herself in a thick cloak and went walking in the grounds. The formal gardens near the house were impeccably maintained, geometric and severe, offering no comfort. But drawn by a high stone wall covered in ivy, she followed a winding, overgrown path. She found a small, iron-banded wooden door set into the wall. It was rusted and stiff, but with a firm push, it groaned open. She stepped through and gasped. Before her lay what must have once been a place of breathtaking beauty. It was a walled garden, a secret, hidden world, but it was a world utterly reclaimed by nature. Weeds choked elegant stone pathways. Roses grew wild and tangled, their thorny arms reaching for the sky in a desperate, chaotic embrace. A small central fountain was silent, its basin filled with stagnant water and fallen leaves. The skeletons of ornate iron benches were being slowly consumed by moss and ivy. It was a place of profound neglect, a beautiful thing left to die. Yet, even in its decay, there was a sense of peace, a whisper of the love that had once been poured into it. She felt an immediate, inexplicable connection to this forgotten place. It was a reflection of the house, of the family within it, a heart left untended, overgrown with the thorns of grief and sorrow. That evening, she found Mrs. Gable polishing silver in the butler's pantry. "Mrs. Gable," Ilara began, her tone gentle, "I found a walled garden behind the east lawn today. It seems forgotten." The housekeeper's hand stilled. A shuttered look came over her face. "We do not go there, my lady. The Marquis's orders." "Why?" Ilara pressed softly. Mrs. Gable looked down at the silver fork in her hand, her expression softening with a sorrow that seemed fresh despite the years. "It was her ladyship's garden. The first Marchioness, Isabella. It was her sanctuary. She designed it herself, planted every flower. After she was gone, his lordship had it locked. He could not bear to look at it. He ordered the gardeners to let it be." Isabella's garden? The words resonated deep within Ilara. This was the heart of the house's sorrow, a living memorial to a dead woman now dying itself. A seed of an idea, fragile but insistent, took root in Ilara's mind. It was a mad idea, a reckless one. It was a direct defiance of her husband's unspoken will, but it was also the first thing that had sparked a genuine feeling of purpose in her since she had arrived. She would not let this beautiful place die. The next day she put on a pair of old leather gloves she found in a potting shed, and armed with a pair of shears, she went back to the walled garden. She started small, clearing the weeds from a single flagstone on the path. The work was hard, her muscles unaccustomed to the strain. But with every weed she pulled, with every thorny branch she clipped, she felt a small piece of the oppressive weight on her own spirit begin to lift. She was not just clearing a path, she was letting in the light. She worked for hours, losing herself in the simple, repetitive rhythm of the task. She focused on one small corner, a bed where a few hardy lavender plants were struggling for survival amidst a thicket of nettles. Carefully she cleared the space around them, her hands growing sore, her face smudged with dirt. She did not hear the soft footfall on the grass behind her. When she finally straightened up, stretching her aching back, she saw her. Lily was standing just inside the garden gate, her small form framed by the crumbling stone archway. She was watching Ilara, her dark eyes wide with a silent, solemn curiosity. For the first time since Ilara had arrived, the child was not looking out a window, away from the world. She was looking at her. Ilara's heart gave a painful lurch. She stayed perfectly still, afraid any sudden movement would break the spell. She offered a small, gentle smile. "Hello, Lily," she said softly. Lily did not answer. She did not move, but she did not run away. She simply stood and watched as Ilara, her heart beating with a fragile, burgeoning hope, turned back to her work, gently tending to the forgotten lavender. This became their new ritual. Every afternoon that the weather allowed, Ilara would go to the garden, and every afternoon Lily would appear at the gate, a silent, watchful sentinel. She never came closer, but she never left. She would stay for an hour or more, her gaze following Ilara's every move. It was a strange, silent companionship, a connection forged across a distance of 10 yards and an ocean of unspoken pain. Ilara learned to talk to the garden as if it were the child. "I think this rose wants more sun, don't you?" she would murmur, pruning a tangled branch. "And these poor irises are so thirsty." She spoke of colors, of scents, of the promise of what the garden could be. She never demanded a response, never pushed for a reaction. She simply filled the quiet space with her gentle voice and her patient work. One afternoon, a week into her project, Ilara was kneeling by the choked fountain, trying to clear the leaves from its basin. Her fingers were raw and her back ached, but she had managed to clear a small section of the stone surround. As she worked, she felt a tiny presence beside her. She looked up slowly. Lily was standing there, not 5 feet away. She had left the safety of the gate. In her small, outstretched hand, she held a single, perfect white blossom, a snowdrop that had somehow managed to push its way through the matted leaves. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. Time seemed to stop. The child's eyes, so like her father's but without the coldness, were fixed on her face. Slowly, as if in a dream, Ilara reached out and took the flower. Her fingers brushed against Lily's, and the child's skin was cool and soft. "Thank you, Lily," Ilara whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It's beautiful." Lily did not smile, but the rigid set of her small shoulders seemed to soften. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, then turned and walked, not ran, back to the gate and disappeared. Ilara was left kneeling by the fountain, the delicate white snowdrop held in her dirt-stained hand. It was the most precious gift she had ever received. It was not just a flower, it was a beginning, unseen by either of them from a second-story window in the west wing of the house, his study. Alistair had watched the entire exchange. He had stood half-hidden by the heavy velvet curtain, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had watched this woman, his stranger of a wife, kneel in the dirt of his dead wife's garden. He had seen his silent, unreachable daughter voluntarily approach her. He had seen the offering of the flower, a maelstrom of emotions he had long since buried, anger, resentment, and something else. Something he refused to name, warred within him. His first instinct was to storm down there, to put a stop to this desecration of a sacred space. But he had not moved. He had simply watched, his face an unreadable mask of stone, as a single fragile flower changed the landscape of his frozen world. The small moment with the snowdrop became a turning point, a subtle shift in the gravitational pull of the household. Lily no longer remained at the garden gate. She began to venture further in, a small shadow trailing Ilara as she worked. She would sit on a newly cleared patch of grass and watch, her silence still profound, but now it felt less like a wall and more like a quiet observation. Sometimes she would point to a particular flower, and Ilara would tell her its name, describing its color and scent. It was a one-sided conversation, but it felt meaningful. Beatrice noticed the change and did not like it. Her intrusions became more frequent, her comments sharper. "My dear, you'll ruin your hands," she'd said one afternoon, appearing at the garden gate. The very picture of fashionable elegance. She eyed Ilara's dirt-smudged apron and practical work dress with distaste. "A marchioness does not perform the duties of a common gardener. What will the staff think?" "The staff will think I am a marchioness who is not afraid of hard work," Ilara replied calmly, not pausing in her task of tying up a climbing rose. "And you are encouraging the child's fancies," Beatrice went on, her gaze flicking towards Lily, who immediately shrank back. "She needs structure, not mud pies and make-believe. Alistair will not be pleased that you are disturbing Isabella's garden. It is a place of memory." "Perhaps memories, like gardens, need tending lest they become overgrown and forgotten," Ilara said, her voice quiet but firm. Beatrice's lips thinned into a hard line. "You are new here. You do not understand." Ilara understood perfectly. She understood that Beatrice saw Lily not as a child to be nurtured, but as a key to Alistair's sympathy and a justification for her own power in the household. Ilara's growing bond with the girl was a direct threat to that. The true test, however, came from Alistair. A few days after Lily had given her the flower, Ilara encountered him in the main hall as she was returning from the garden, her hands earthy and a stray leaf in her hair. He stopped, his grey eyes sweeping over her disheveled appearance. She braced herself for a cold reprimand, for the order to cease her work. He looked at her for a long, silent moment. "Finch informs me you have requested a considerable quantity of bone meal and rose fertilizer from the village," he said, his voice flat and devoid of inflection. "Yes, my lord," she answered, lifting her chin. "The soil is badly depleted." She waited for the explosion, the cold fury. Instead, he gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. "See that the bill is sent to my steward." and then he walked on, leaving her standing in the hall, utterly stunned. It was not approval, not by any stretch of the imagination, but it was not a prohibition either. It was a silent, grudging acquiescence. He had seen what she was doing, and for reasons she could not fathom, he was allowing it to continue. It was the first crack in the wall of his indifference, a sliver of light in the gloom. The garden began to respond to her care. Underneath the weeds and thorns, the bones of a magnificent design were revealed. She uncovered winding paths of flagstone, a stone bench carved with intertwined ivy, and beds that, with clearing and feeding, began to show signs of life. Dormant perennials sent up new green shoots. The roses, pruned of their dead wood, began to form tight, promising buds. It was as if the garden itself was taking a deep breath after years of being suffocated. And as the garden healed, so did a small part of the child who watched over it. One sunny afternoon, Ilara was humming a simple folk tune as she worked. She was surprised to hear a faint, reedy sound from behind her. She turned. Lily was sitting on the grass, a small, smooth stone in each hand, tapping them together in a clumsy but unmistakable imitation of the rhythm of the song. Their eyes met, and for a fleeting second, the ghost of a smile touched Lily's lips before she looked down, suddenly shy. Ilara's heart swelled. It was not a word, but it was a sound. It was communication. It was a note of music in a house that had been silent for far too long. Later that week, Ilara was in the library, searching for a book on horticulture she had seen on a high shelf. The library was Alistair's domain, a cavernous room filled with the scent of leather and old paper. She rarely entered it, respecting it as his private sanctum. She was perched precariously on the rolling ladder when she heard the door open. It was Alistair. He stopped short upon seeing her. "Lady Blackwood," he said, his tone formal. "My lord," she replied, her balance wavering slightly. "Forgive the intrusion. I was just looking for a book." He walked over to the ladder, his presence immense and unsettlingly close. He looked up at her, and for the first time, she felt he was truly seeing her, not as a title or a function, but as a person. "The clematis," he said, the words abrupt, "on the west wall of the garden. It requires a hard pruning in the spring if you expect it to flower." Ilara stared down at him, astonished. It was the first time he had ever spoken of the garden, ever acknowledged her work there with anything other than tacit permission. More than that, it was a piece of advice. It was a shared piece of knowledge. My first wife planted it," he added, his voice suddenly rough, as if the words were stones in his throat. He looked away towards the fireplace, his jaw tightening. She was very proud of it. The air crackled with unspoken history. He was sharing a piece of his past, a tiny, fractured memory of Isabella. It was a monumental offering from a man who had sealed his heart in a tomb. "Thank you, my lord," Ilara said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "I will see to it." He gave another of his sharp nods and turned, striding from the room as quickly as he had entered, leaving Ilara clinging to the ladder, her heart pounding. He was not a statue after all. Inside the marble casing, there was a man who remembered where his wife had planted her flowers. It was a glimmer of humanity so profound, so unexpected, that it felt like the sun breaking through the clouds. Beatrice's campaign against Ilara escalated, from subtle sabotage to open warfare. Seeing the fragile bond forming between Ilara and Lily, and sensing the infinitesimal thaw in the Marquis's glacial demeanor, she became desperate. Her position as the de facto mistress of Blackwood was eroding with every weed Ilara pulled, with every silent smile Lily offered. The crisis came on a Tuesday. Ilara was in the garden with Lily, who was now actively helping in her small way, her tiny hands patting down the soil around a newly planted pansy. A carriage, unfamiliar and ostentatious, crunched up the gravel drive. An hour later, Beatrice found them, her face a mask of grave concern. "Ilara, you must come at once," she said, her voice pitched with false urgency. "It is about Lily." A cold dread washed over Ilara. She took Lily's hand and followed Beatrice back into the house, into the formal drawing room. There, waiting with Alistair, was a severe-looking man with a black medical bag. Alistair himself looked grim, his face set like granite. "This is Dr. Hemlock," Beatrice announced. "I took the liberty of consulting him. I have been so terribly worried about Lily's continued silence, her vacant spells in the garden. He is an expert in nervous afflictions of the young." Dr. Hemlock looked at Lily, who had hidden behind Ilara's skirts, and then at Ilara, his eyes cold and clinical. "Lady Beatrice has described the child's condition, a prolonged state of traumatic mutism coupled with an obsession with unstructured, dirty activities." He shot a pointed look at Ilara's still earthy hands. "This is not conducive to recovery. In my professional opinion, the child requires a more controlled environment, a sanitarium where she can receive proper scientific treatment away from potentially disruptive influences. The word sanitarium struck Ilara like a physical blow. A cold, sterile institution for her gentle, fragile Lily. It was a prison sentence. This was Beatrice's masterstroke. To have Lily declared mentally unfit, to have her sent away, and to frame Ilara's gentle, patient work in the garden as a disruptive influence. Absolutely not, Ilara said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. She pulled Lily closer, her protective instincts raging. Lily is not sick. She is grieving. She is healing. She is making progress here, with me. Progress? Beatrice scoffed, dropping her mask of concern. She is silent, and she plays in the dirt. You are indulging a fantasy, Ilara. You are unqualified. I am thinking of what is best for the child. You are thinking of what is best for you, Ilara retorted, her eyes flashing. She turned her attention to the one person who truly mattered. She looked directly at her husband. His face was unreadable, his grey eyes shadowed. For all she knew, he might agree with the cold logic of the doctor. Their entire marriage was a contract, perhaps. He saw his daughter's care in the same unemotional light. "My lord," she said, her voice trembling slightly but full of conviction. "Alistair, look at your daughter. She is not a case study in a medical book. She is a child who lost her mother in the most horrific way imaginable. She needs love, not a sterile room. She needs patience, not a regimen. She needs the sun and the earth. She is beginning to come back to us. I know she is. Please, do not do this. Do not let them take her away." The room was silent, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Lily was clutching Ilara's dress, her small body trembling. Alistair's gaze moved from Ilara's impassioned face down to the top of his daughter's dark head, and then to his cousin. He looked at Beatrice, truly looked at her, and in his eyes something cold and hard seemed to crystallize. He had been blind, wrapped in his own grief, allowing Beatrice to manage his life, his home, his child. He saw her now, not as his helpful cousin, but as a vulture, circling. He turned to the doctor. "Your professional opinion is noted, Dr. Hemlock," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "and it is dismissed. You will send your bill to my steward. Finch will see you out." The doctor, flustered by this abrupt dismissal, stammered a protest, but a single look from the Marquis silenced him. He gathered his bag and scurried out of the room. Alistair then fixed his gaze on Beatrice. The coldness in his eyes was no longer the remote, indifferent cold Ilara was used to. It was the sharp, lethal cold of glacial ice. "Beatrice," he said, each word dropping like a shard of glass, "your concern for my daughter's welfare is touching. However, your oversight in this matter is no longer required. Lady Blackwood is the Marchioness. She is Lily's mother now. All decisions regarding my daughter's care will be hers and hers alone. Is that understood?" Beatrice's face went white, then mottled with rage. The public humiliation was absolute. She had overplayed her hand and lost spectacularly. "Alistair, you cannot be serious. This nobody—" "She is my wife," Alistair cut in, his voice like the crack of a whip, "and you are my guest. I suggest you remember that." Without another word, Beatrice turned and swept from the room, her back rigid with fury. The silence she left behind was profound. Ilara stood, her heart hammering against her ribs, her arm wrapped tightly around Lily. She had challenged him, argued with him, pleaded with him in front of his family, and he had sided with her. He had defended her. He had called her Lily's mother. "Thank you," she whispered, looking at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears of relief. Alistair did not answer immediately. He looked exhausted, as if the short, brutal confrontation had drained him of all his reserves. He ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture of profound weariness. "She should never have been allowed such authority," he said, more to himself than to Ilara. "I have been absent." He looked at Ilara, and his grey eyes were filled with a tumult of emotions she could not decipher. "You were right. About Lily. I see it too. The light. It is returning." He took a hesitant step towards them, then another. He knelt, slowly, awkwardly, so that he was on eye level with his daughter. It was the first time Ilara had ever seen him do so. "Lily," he said, his voice rough with an unfamiliar tenderness. He reached out a hand, not to touch her, but simply holding it open in the space between them. "Are you happy in the garden?" Lily, who was still pressed against Ilara, peeked out at her father. She looked from his outstretched hand to his face. And then she did something extraordinary. She let go of Ilara's dress, took a tiny, hesitant step forward, and placed her small hand in his. Alistair's breath hitched. He closed his eyes for a moment, his throat working. When he opened them again, they were raw with a pain so deep and so vast that Ilara felt her own heart break in sympathy. He had not just taken his daughter's hand, he had taken the first step out of the tomb he had built for himself. They were, all three of them, standing on the precipice of something new, a fragile alliance forged in the face of a common threat. That night, a storm broke over Blackwood Manor. It was a tempest of biblical proportions, with wind that shrieked like a banshee and rain that lashed against the window panes in furious horizontal sheets. Thunder cracked and rolled, shaking the very foundations of the old house. Ilara lay in her bed, listening to the storm, her mind replaying the afternoon's dramatic events. Alistair's defense of her, of Lily, had been a seismic shock. It had redrawn the lines of their relationship, transforming it from a cold contract into something else. Something with the potential for warmth. Unable to sleep, she rose and pulled on a dressing gown, drawn to the library. Its towering shelves and the familiar scent of old books always brought her a sense of comfort. A single lamp was lit, casting a pool of golden light in the immense shadowed room. And in that light, silhouetted against a tall window where lightning intermittently bleached the sky white, stood Alistair. He was holding a brandy snifter, but he was not drinking. He was simply staring out at the violent chaos of the storm, his posture rigid. He did not seem surprised to see her. "I find I cannot sleep on nights like this," he said, his voice quiet, almost lost beneath the roar of the wind. "The storm, it reminds me of that night." Ilara knew instantly which night he meant, the night of the fire, the night that had defined him, that had hollowed him out, and left this cold shell of a man in his place. She came to stand near him, a respectful distance away, her hands clasped before her. She would not pry. If he wished to speak, she would listen. He was silent for a long time, watching the storm rage. The lightning flashed, illuminating his face, and she saw the raw agony etched there. The mask was gone. In its place was only a man, drowning in his own memory. "It started in the nursery wing," he began, his voice low and strained. "A fallen ember from the fireplace," they said. "It was so fast, the smoke, the heat." He swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on some point in the distant rain-lashed darkness. "I woke to the screaming. I ran. I found Lily's nursemaid in the corridor, her clothes on fire. I got to the nursery, and the room was an inferno. I found Lily in her cot, screaming, but she was alive. I wrapped her in a blanket, and I carried her out." He paused, taking a ragged breath. The story poured from him, a torrent of grief held back for too long. "I got her outside, into the cold air. I gave her to Finch. And I turned to go back for Isabella. Her rooms were next to the nursery, but she was already coming out. She was safe. She was there, on the lawn. And then she looked at me, her face wild with panic, and she screamed, 'The locket!'" His voice broke on the last word. "It was a small, foolish thing, a gold locket I had given her, with a miniature of me on one side and a space for Lily's on the other. It was on her dressing table. She said she couldn't leave it. I told her no. I begged her. I held her arm, but she pulled away from me. She was so fast. She just ran. Back into the house, back into the fire." He fell silent, the only sound the drumming of the rain and his own harsh breathing. "I tried to follow her," he whispered, his voice raw. "The roof of the corridor collapsed. The fireman had to hold me back. I stood there on the lawn with my daughter in my arms, and I watched the place where my wife had gone be consumed by flames. I did nothing. I stood there, and I let her die. For a locket!" The confession hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. This was the source of his coldness, the root of his pain. It wasn't just grief. It was a monstrous, crushing guilt. He blamed himself. Tears were streaming down Ilara's face, silent tears of empathy for this broken man and the impossible weight he carried. She stepped closer, her earlier hesitation gone, replaced by an overwhelming need to offer some small comfort. "It was not your fault," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Alistair, you cannot blame yourself. You saved your daughter. You tried to stop her. In that moment of panic and fear, people do not think rationally. She wanted a piece of the life she was losing. You cannot carry this burden." "How can I not?" he asked, turning to face her at last. His grey eyes were swimming with unshed tears, a sight so shocking, so vulnerable that it stole her breath. "I am her husband. I was supposed to protect her, and I failed. Every day since, I have seen her face, running back into that fire. Every day, I have failed her again by closing myself off, by letting this house become a tomb, by letting my own daughter grow up in silence because her father is a ghost." "But you are not a ghost," Ilara insisted, her voice gaining strength. She reached out, her hand hovering for a moment before she placed it gently on his arm. His muscles were rigid beneath the fine wool of his dressing gown. "A ghost could not have stood up to that doctor today. A ghost could not have defended his child. A ghost does not remember which flowers his wife planted." His gaze dropped to her hand on his arm. He looked at it as if it were a foreign object. Then, slowly, his own hand came up and covered hers. His skin was cool, but his grip was firm, desperate, the touch of a drowning man clinging to a piece of driftwood. "You have brought light back into this house," he stammered, the words costing him a visible effort. "You have reached my daughter where no one else could. You have tended my wife's garden. You do not run from the ghosts, Ilara. You give them peace." The storm outside raged on, but in the quiet lamp-lit library the storm inside Alistair Beaumont had finally broken. He stood before her, stripped of his anger, his coldness, his pride, revealing the wounded heart beneath. And Ilara, looking at him not as the cold Marquis of their contract, but as a man in desperate need of healing, knew that her life in this house was no longer about survival. It was about salvation, not just for Lily or for the garden, but for the man who stood before her, his hand holding hers, as if he might never let go. The confession in the library was a catharsis that changed everything. The storm passed, and the morning dawned clear and bright. The world outside washed clean. It felt like a metaphor for the atmosphere within the house. The oppressive weight of unspoken grief had lifted, replaced by something fragile but hopeful. Alistair was different. The change was not dramatic or sudden, but a series of small, significant shifts. He began to join Ilara and Lily for breakfast. He did not say much at first, but his presence was no longer a cold absence. It was a quiet, watchful warmth. He would look at Ilara across the table, a question in his eyes, a silent acknowledgement of the intimacy they had shared. Beatrice, unable to endure her diminished status and the new, united front of the family, departed within the week, her farewells as cold and sharp as her wit. Her absence left a vacuum that was quickly filled with a tentative peace. Alistair started to walk with Ilara to the walled garden in the afternoons. He would stand at the edge of the path, watching her work, watching Lily. He spoke more of Isabella, not with the raw agony of his confession, but with a gentle, reminiscent sadness. He pointed out the climbing rose. "Isabella called this one the Duchess," he said, a faint smile touching his lips. "She said it was regal, but temperamental." He was sharing his memories, entrusting them to her. He was allowing Ilara to see the woman his first wife had been, not as a rival or a ghost to be feared, but as a part of the history of the man he was. Ilara, in turn, spoke of her plans for the garden, of the colors she imagined for the summer beds. They were not just talking about flowers. They were talking about the future. One bright, sunny afternoon, Ilara was on her knees showing Lily how to separate lavender seedlings. Lily was fully absorbed, her small brow furrowed in concentration as she mimicked Ilara's movements with her own tiny trowel. "Like this?" a small, clear voice asked. Ilara froze. The voice was high-pitched, hesitant from disuse, but it was unmistakably a voice, a word. She looked at Lily, whose dark eyes were wide, as if surprised by the sound she herself had made. Ilara's heart felt as if it would burst. She smiled, a radiant, tear-filled smile. "Yes, my darling," she said, her own voice choked with emotion. Exactly like that. She looked up and saw Alistair standing by the gate. He had heard it too. His face was a study in disbelief and overwhelming joy. He walked towards them, his steps slow and reverent. As if approaching a miracle, he knelt in the dirt beside them, his fine trousers bedamned. "Lily!" he whispered, his voice thick. Lily looked at her father, and then at Ilara. A genuine, beautiful smile lit up her face. She held up a seedling, its roots dangling with rich, dark earth. "Mama!" she said, her voice clearer this time, and she held the plant out not to Alistair, but to Ilara. The word struck Ilara with the force of a physical blow. Mama! It was an acceptance, a claiming, a bond forged and now named. She looked at Alistair, her eyes asking a silent question. His own eyes were shining, and he gave her a nod, a look of such profound gratitude and love that it made her dizzy. He was not just giving her permission, he was affirming the truth of the word. In that moment, in the heart of the resurrected garden, they became a family. The intimacy between them grew with each passing day. It was a courtship in reverse, discovering the heart of the man she had already married. They fell into a habit of spending their evenings in the library, not in silence, but in comfortable companionship. They would read or talk, their conversations ranging from estate business to philosophy, from their childhoods to their hopes. She discovered he had a dry, unexpected wit. He discovered she had a keen, analytical mind. One evening, as they sat before the fire, he put down his book and looked at her. The firelight danced in his eyes, turning the winter grey to a warm, soft silver. "I have not been fair to you, Ilara," he said, his voice low and serious. "I brought you here under the coldest of terms. I offered you a title and a house, but I gave you a prison of my own making. I asked you to be a mother to my child while I was barely a father. I burdened you with my grief without offering any of myself in return. You were grieving," she said softly. "You did what you thought you had to do to survive." "Perhaps," he conceded. "But you did more than survive. You chose to live." You walked into the darkest corners of this house, into the silence and the sorrow, and you were not afraid. You brought life back to the garden. You brought life back to my daughter." He paused, his gaze intense. "You have brought life back to me." He stood and came to her, kneeling before her chair, just as he had knelt in the garden. He took both of her hands in his. "Our marriage was a contract," he said, his voice resonating with deep emotion. "A business arrangement. I would like, if you would have me, to start again. Not as a Marquis seeking a suitable bride, but as Alistair, a man who has, against all odds, and certainly against his own intentions, fallen completely and irrevocably in love with his wife." Ilara's heart soared. The words she had never dared to hope for, the dreams she had buried on the day of their arrangement, were being offered to her now freely and with a sincerity that was breathtaking. "I love you, Ilara," he whispered, lifting her hand to his lips. "Not as a replacement for what I lost, but as the woman who taught me how to live again, the woman who healed my heart." Tears of joy traced paths down her cheeks. "And I love you, Alistair," she answered, her voice trembling. "I think I have from the very beginning." He rose, pulling her gently to her feet. He framed her face with his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks, wiping away her tears. "Then be my wife," he murmured, "my true wife, in every sense of the word." He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion and fire, but one of tenderness, of reverence, of promises made and futures sealed. It was a kiss that tasted of gratitude and hope, a kiss that swept away the last shadows of the past and welcomed the dawn. In the quiet warmth of the library, the loveless contract was finally, irrevocably consumed by the fire of a true and deeply earned love. Their renewed commitment transformed Blackwood Manor. The somber silence was replaced by the sound of Lily's chatter, the heavy velvet drapes were pulled back to let in the sun, and the entire house seemed to exhale a long-held breath of sorrow. Ilara, no longer just the mistress of the household, but the beloved heart of the family, found a joy in her duties that had been absent before. She and Alistair were inseparable, a true partnership in running the estate and in raising their daughter. The locked wing, the burnt-out shell that had been a monument to Alistair's guilt, was finally addressed. On a crisp autumn morning, he took Ilara's hand and led her to the door that had been sealed for years. "It is time to rebuild," he said, his voice firm. He unlocked the door and pushed it open, revealing the charred timbers and blackened stone. It was a scar on the face of the house. "We will make it a conservatory," Ilara suggested, her mind already seeing the possibilities. "Filled with light and flowers, a place for life to grow." Alistair looked at her, his eyes filled with love. "A perfect idea," he agreed. Society, ever curious, began to take note of the changes in the reclusive Marquis of Blackwood. Invitations began to arrive, and to the astonishment of the ton, some were accepted. Their first major social outing was a grand ball, hosted by the Duke of Carrington. Ilara was nervous, but as she descended the grand staircase of Blackwood Manor, with Alistair waiting at the bottom, his eyes alight with adoration, her fears melted away. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk that shimmered in the candlelight, and around her neck was not a cold diamond necklace, but a simple gold locket on a delicate chain, a new one. It held a miniature of Lily on one side, and a tiny, exquisitely painted portrait of Alistair on the other. At the ball, they were the center of attention. The Marquis, so long absent, was now seen with a beautiful, serene woman on his arm, his entire demeanor transformed. He was no longer the cold, brooding figure of rumor, but a man deeply in love. Of course, not everyone was pleased. Lord Ashworth, a pompous and petty rival of Alistair's, saw an opportunity for mischief. He cornered a small group, speaking just loudly enough for Ilara and Alistair, who were approaching to overhear. "A lovely girl, the new Marchioness," Ashworth drawled, a malicious glint in his eye. "A pity about her bloodline, of course. The Vances are practically destitute. Some might say she's far too poor for such a grand title. One wonders what the Marquis was thinking." Ilara stiffened, the familiar sting of her family's shame, a sudden, unwelcome guest at the celebration. Before she could react, Alistair stepped forward, his hand resting protectively on the small of her back. His face was calm, but his grey eyes were lethal. He addressed Ashworth directly, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden hush that had fallen over the group. "Lord Ashworth," he said, his tone dangerously pleasant, "I find your assessment of my wife's worth to be gravely in error." He turned his gaze to Ilara, a look of fierce, unwavering devotion on his face. Then he looked back at the stunned lord. "Lady Ilara's worth is beyond any title, any measure of gold. Her compassion, her strength, and her heart are treasures no vault could ever hold. If her blood is deemed too poor for my rank," he said, his voice resonating with conviction, "then I'll take none. I would be Mr. Blackwood with her than a king." Without a collective gasp went through the onlookers. The declaration was so total, so utterly romantic and dismissive of the rigid social hierarchy they all inhabited, that it left them speechless. Lord Ashworth flushed a deep, mortified crimson and stammered an apology before melting into the crowd. Alistair turned back to Ilara, whose eyes were shining with tears of love and pride. He had not just defended her. He had declared, in front of the entire world, that she was his world. He was her champion. He offered her his arm. "Shall we dance, my love?" he murmured, a small triumphant smile playing on his lips. "I would be delighted, Mr. Blackwood," she whispered back, her heart overflowing. As he led her onto the dance floor, she knew that all the ghosts had been laid to rest. The cold arrangement, the loveless contract, the whispers of society, they were all meaningless ash. All that mattered was the warm, strong hand holding hers, and the promise of a lifetime of love with the man who had not only healed his own heart, but had given her a home within it. 1 year later, the conservatory stood where the scar of the fire had once been. It was a magnificent structure of glass and iron, filled with lush greenery and vibrant exotic flowers. The scent of jasmine and citrus hung in the warm, humid air. It was a testament to new life, a symbol of their future. Ilara sat on a white iron bench, a book lying forgotten in her lap. She was no longer reading, she was watching her family. Her belly was round and full, with the new life she and Alistair had created, a child to be born of love and joy, not duty. Alistair was on the floor, engaged in a game of make-believe with a chattering, laughing Lily. He was a great growling bear, and she was a fearless knight, fending him off with a peacock feather for a sword. His deep laughter echoed through the glass house, a sound that Ilara now knew as well as her own heartbeat. It was a sound she had once thought impossible. The walled garden was in full, riotous bloom, a masterpiece of color and scent that was now known throughout the county as the Marchioness's Garden. It was a place of peace and beauty, its gate always open. Lily, having vanquished the bear, ran to Ilara and clambered onto the bench beside her, resting a small hand on her mother's swollen abdomen. "Is the baby sleeping?" she whispered, her dark eyes serious. "I think so, my love." Ilara smiled, stroking her daughter's silky hair. Alistair came to them, his face flushed with laughter, a smudge of dirt on his cheek. He sat on her other side, draping an arm around her shoulders and pressing a kiss to her temple. "All is well, my lady?" he asked, his voice a low, contented murmur against her hair. "All is perfect," she replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. She looked at her husband, her daughter, and felt the gentle kick of the child within her. She thought of the desperate, frightened girl who had arrived at this cold, grey house a lifetime ago. She had come here expecting a prison and had found a paradise. She had been sold into a loveless marriage and had found the greatest love of her life. Blackwood Manor was no longer a house of shadows and grief. It was a home filled with light, with laughter, and with a love that had been patiently, painstakingly cultivated, like a forgotten garden brought back to glorious, vibrant life. They had faced the ghosts of the past and built a future on foundations of compassion, trust, and a devotion that was stronger than any title, richer than any fortune. And as the sun streamed through the glass walls of the conservatory, Ilara knew, with a certainty that filled her soul, that this was only the beginning. Dear listener, isn't it a powerful thought that the most beautiful gardens are often the ones that have been reclaimed from neglect? The story of Ilara and Alistair reminds us that hearts, much like gardens, can become overgrown with the weeds of grief, guilt, and fear. We see someone's walls, their coldness, their distance, and we assume the ground is barren. We believe nothing can grow there. But Ilara didn't see a wasteland. She saw the forgotten potential. She didn't arrive with a battering ram to tear down Alistair's walls. She simply found a small, locked gate, and with patience and gentle care, she began to tend to the forgotten soil within. She knew that you cannot force a flower to bloom. You can only create the conditions for it to do so. You can clear the weeds, let in the sun, and offer patient, quiet nourishment. How many of us have encountered a locked garden in our own lives? It might be a friend, a family member, or even a part of ourselves that we've closed off due to past hurts. We might be tempted to either give up on it entirely or try to force it open. But true healing, true connection, often comes from the quietest actions, the consistent showing up, the gentle word, the simple act of tending to something with love, without demanding an immediate result. Ilara's greatest strength was her patience. She offered her care freely, and in doing so she not only brought a forgotten garden back to life, but she also guided a lost family back to the sun. So, the next time you encounter a heart that seems closed for good, perhaps remember the lesson of the walled garden. Look for a small gate, a tiny crack, offer a little light, a little care, and have faith in the life that is waiting, dormant, just beneath the surface. You might be surprised by the beauty that blooms. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who might need a reminder that even the most neglected gardens can bloom again. Your support helps these stories grow.